Thank you for joining us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. I'm your on-air producer, Jon Ekstrom, filling in for our host, Peter Moore, who is unfortunately absent today, but I will do my best to do right by him. My guest today is Michael Sandoval. You are the managing editor of Western Wire. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Pleasure to be here today.
So, tell me a little bit about Western Wire. How did it develop? What was the origin story? And what is it kind of designed to do?
So Western Wire is a project of the Western Energy Alliance, and it's a industry trade group, and they are concerned with telling sort of the rest of the story. And so Western Wire is a news website that is focused on energy policy, oil and gas policy from a federal and state perspective, but the goal is to add value add and tell sort of the rest of the story when it comes to anything from coverage of the election in 2018 last year to things like the development of federal regulations, federal policy, legislation going on in Washington, D.C. So it's kind of a little bit of everything between state and local all the way up to federal, and just filling in those gaps. We really have a niche, but it's a large niche that's sort of been left open by what I would describe as the ongoing transition of regular media that is either understaffed because of the way things are going in places like the Denver Post. They don't have a dedicated energy reporter like they used to. We've lost experience at places like Denver Business Journal with folks moving on to other positions, and so what you're left with is sort of an information gap as far as reporting in this industry, in this sector. And so Western Wire, I think the origin 2 years ago now, we're going on our third full year, is to fill that gap and bring attention to things that just aren't being covered at all, or again adding value and sort of the other side of the story when it comes to oil and gas policy in the Rocky Mountain West, and that's sort of our purview.
Right, providing a layer of nuance that perhaps is missing. I know one of my frustrations when I worked for an E&P company was I'd get new reporters all the time, for instance, Greeley Tribune, or even at that local level. But in particular, I mean, you mentioned the Denver Post, and I've heard it called a hollowing out of the Denver Post. And I remember when I started in this industry, you had the Post and the Rocky, and you had, Gargi Chakrabarty was one of the reporters, and Steve Robbie, and back then there was still Bruce Finley and Mark Jaffe. There were, I mean, that's four off the top of my head right there. And now, is there one that's dedicated?
I think Bruce is still there.
Oh yeah, Bruce is still there. You're right. So I mean, there's just one. And I remember I had to educate every single reporter that I worked with, and I was doing rig tours constantly. I was taking them out, just giving them a snapshot into the industry that was missing previously. And so this, to me, is an interesting niche. What has the reaction been from either mainstream media or anyone else?
Well, I think the examples at Denver Business Journal, someone like Kathy Proctor, who has a lot of institutional memory in addition to covering the subject matter,
who's been on this show twice, actually.
You lose that when those folks move on or they retire or whatever.
Right.
And so it isn't a criticism of the newer reporters, the folks that are just graduating or coming in, or they're sort of general assignment and they're tasked every now and then to cover industry. They're just sort of left with an information gap. I think part of the success of Western Wire has been to fill that information gap and essentially, for lack of a better term, provide a cheat sheet that reporters can take a look at. And I think the reaction, one of the best reactions we had in 2018 was from Kyle Clark on 9 News here in Denver, was just that we have, you can take what Western Wire's putting out there, because we put out there that we're a project of Western Energy Alliance. I mean, every single email I ever send out for interview request or for information, everything always includes that we're a project of Western Energy Alliance, with a link to the Western Energy Alliance site and our website, so that people know where we're coming from when I'm talking to any politician, elected official, policy person in DC. Like they always get the spiel of who we are, so that they know who they're talking to.
Right.
And that's for folks who might be considered on our side on industry and folks who were opposed, and we've gotten good response. We actually got Representative Diana DeGette to give us a quote, which is significant because even regular media folks have been frustrated by someone. She doesn't give quotes very often. So those are successes. I think the success is in providing, sometimes it's a rapid response kind of, quick article explaining more about the issue, or as I know we'll get into a little later, who the groups are that are opposing oil and gas production in this state and in other states. And so providing them the background and getting them up to speed super quick so that they can fill out their story in a very clear, and they've got stuff at their fingertips rather than just being like, oh, here's a PR press release. We've got 2 years of stories after stories. We've got dedicated beats on several topics, and we just try to build those out. And so there is a track record, and like I said, going into our third year, it's not a fly by night, just one off. Right. Attached to a cycle, which we've definitely seen previously. So that's been sort of our success for the first 2 years going into the third year.
Right, and that makes good sense to me. And the issue of transparency is really important here, because you're not putting on airs saying that, hey, we're independent journalism. No, you're not. You're a product of the Western Energy Alliance. To that end, has it been challenging? I mean, do people view you as, having an agenda? And is there an agenda at work other than, filling in the complete picture? That's your sort of reason for existence. Mm-hmm. But do people ever question that and say, well, this ultimately at the end of the day is pro-industry?
I think they have no problem with that part, simply because we are upfront about it. I mean, we've had pretty regular success with the outgoing administration in Colorado with Governor Hickenlooper and his folks, in sending them requests for information or requests for comment, and getting some pretty frequent responses. The same thing goes for other elected officials. As long as we are transparent, I don't really think that there's much of a difference. They don't really see, the agenda is up front, so it's not. There's no sort of we're not trying to.
There's not like nefarious subtext.
No. There's no bait and switch is what I'm looking for. So they know where we're coming from, and certainly after, like I said, 2 years now, they can see that what we've covered. I think the approach has been completely above board. When we were approaching both attorney general candidates in this previous election. We sent the same email to both of them and said, here's a request for, an interview, and you guys are getting the same questions. There's no difference. And it was like, it was appreciated that we weren't trying to again. I think in many cases that they're afraid of the subtle attack or something like that, like the bait and switch. Try to say something and then misconstrue it or whatever. And so I think the product largely dispels that concern. They can easily look up what we've written about before on the subject if they want to take the time, if they're concerned in any way. So no, it hasn't been a problem, and if there are issues, it has been with, by and large, the groups who would be, in support of things like the setback measure, who are much more, keep it in the ground folks. But even they, and some of their Facebook posts, they were talking about this or that issue, and someone would come in and say, "Oh, that's just an oil and gas industry funded website," and somebody would respond, "Well, but is anything they're saying not true?"
Right.
So we tell you, as Mike Rosen, the old radio guy here in Denver, is like, tell me where you sit before you tell me where you stand. We are always up front, and so there isn't any question about that. And we've been, covering bipartisan. Not just in this state, but across the country. So it hasn't been an issue, and I think our transparency is largely responsible for that.
Can you give me an example of some of the stories that maybe you've covered that the mainstream media has missed, or you've talked about filling in that gap? Where are some of the gaps that you've filled in, perhaps that the traditional media might have fulfilled years ago when they were more fully staffed up, but that Western Wire fills now.
Well, one of the interesting stories we did last year, and it wasn't me, it was my colleague Elena Connolly, who did a story on, there's a professor, researcher, Matthew Nisbet, who put out a report about the more than $500 million of money from large foundations to go to conservation groups, environmental groups. And most of that money had been channeled into educational things, so basically PR.
Right.
And he chronicled how that wasn't very effective in moving the needle on climate issues. So, we took a look at that. We have someone here in Colorado, Roger Pilkey Jr., who is an authority on these issues. So we reached out to him, had a great interview, talked about the report, and it ended up being, she ended up being quoted in the Wall Street Journal. Wow. And it was one of our biggest stories of the year. So covering things that aren't flying under the radar. This is an academic report. It's certainly not a report that would reflect positively on the folks who would be pushing that message. So it kind of got, until we brought it some more prominence, and certainly doing the original reporting and then getting Wall Street Journal to follow is a great accomplishment. The other things would be the lawsuit in Boulder. So the climate lawsuit that filed by City of Boulder, Boulder County, and San Miguel County last April. We were tipped off in January by a very short, mention of it in a Boulder Daily camera story. And I had just gotten back from vacation. I was like, oh, we got this law, maybe look into it. Mm-hmm. So we filed an open records request, found out a bunch of more information. And so we were on top of it from January until April. We knew when the thing was going to happen, when the lawsuit would be announced, filed another open records request. And so, by the summer, we were able to assemble, a complete timeline based on these, documents that showed the effort had begun at least a year earlier. So,
wow.
So not just a discussion happening like in late fall of 2017, but it actually was something that had been pursued basically since April of 2017, roughly.
And resources had been dedicated to that, which is something that is of interest to the public.
Absolutely. And so that was something where there was other outlets who were interested, but we took the ball and brought it along further by filing these open records requests, finding out what the the agreements between the lawyers and the city were, what the parameters were, and stuff like that. So we moved the ball forward in a way that other outlets didn't, and provided them sort of the background, so they would come back and do it. And so those are two of the bigger examples. I think just covering things. It sounds mundane, but it's very important to certainly members of Western Energy Alliance, oil and gas operators, but covering things like the regulatory processes. So it's hearings on, things that are going to affect the Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, hearings that are going to affect EPA. So covering those things, covering those hearings. Nobody. I mean, DC Hill staff, they might cover stuff like that, and E&E News might do that, but nobody's doing it out here.
Right. Well, I mean, it's old school sort of shoe leather journalism. Yeah. One of the purposes of journalism, and particularly in the past and now, but you don't have the resources necessarily now that you used to, is covering school board hearings and county commissioner meetings and city council meetings. For our industry, covering these hearings, having chapter and verse about what was said, what was going on, who attended and said this, here's where they stand on the issue. Having a record of that is important. Otherwise, that slips through the cracks. And again, to your point, the story becomes incomplete. The picture is not filled in all the way. And I'm struck by something that you said. Your background is in journalism, correct?
Well, yeah, a little bit.
Okay. What's funny is you'll hear about, you can read a think piece probably once a month about the death of journalism. Yet journalism, I've found, manifests in really interesting ways now. It may not take the form that you thought it did. I'm personally in the middle of reading Roger Ebert's book, and he was at the Chicago Sun-Times, and he talks about these smoke-filled rooms with everyone on deadline, and everyone's banging away on their stories. But now it takes different forms. And I think about, you've got Western Wire, and I'm remembering a quote from a former editor of Deadspin. And Deadspin you may think of as just a silly sports blog, and certainly it rises out of that, just like photoshopping inappropriate things on people's faces and that kind of thing. But one of the old editors said, what I really want to do is break a story. And Deadspin, this silly little sports blog, broke the Manti Te'o thing, the catfishing scandal, one of the biggest star linebackers in all of college football. They broke that. So journalism is manifesting in interesting places. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there is an impulse, and always has been, that there's you want to find the story, you want to ferret out something that that nobody else is taking a look at. I think it was interesting. One of the earliest successes we had at Western Wire was done by my predecessor before I even came on board, Simon Lomax, who covered the pipeline protests in North Dakota and sort of the aftermath of that. So that started in late 2016. By early 2017, things were wrapping up. Obviously, cold North Dakota winters had worn down the folks that were there. But the story was what was left behind. What was the trash and the refuse and just sort of the mess that was left behind.
And abandoned cars. Abandoned cars.
And that's not an angle that most people would think. It was when I've been around folks, Simon is a good example. Obviously had years of experience in reporting. One of my mentors, Todd Shepard, who's now at the Washington Free Beacon.
And before we go any further, in the interest of full disclosure, Simon Lomax, now research fellow for Vital for Colorado. So not a long walk here. I mean, we work in parallel lanes, Western Wire and Vital for Colorado, no official relationship, but, we're both working to fill in the picture in different ways. Vital is the voice of business. You work for Western Energy Alliance. Simon, previous employee there, now at Vital for Colorado. Yeah. Just want to make that clear. Again, the issue of transparency.
Sure, absolutely. No, but the impulse from those guys is to really look for what is being left out of the story. And it's not something that I would probably think about. And I think I have pretty good journalism chops. So they are always sort of what is the rest of the story?
Sure.
And I keep coming back to that. No, absolutely. But that's the important thing, and that's what would feed our interest in looking at how can we use like an open records request to find out more to the story. Certainly, we get what they give us. Open records don't reveal everything.
Right.
There are limitations in the law, and it's not nothing nefarious. But what are the things that are available there? What can we do to add value? And that really is, I think, the driver for folks on all sides of the thing. There are people, and I would consider them good journalists. They just have a different point of view, and they're coming from the environmental side or the concept, whatever their point of view, and they're doing journalism. They're telling stories that they think are being left out of the mainstream media.
The questions they ask are different.
They're absolutely. Right. But they're still asking, good questions. And if you're not paying attention to them, I was thinking, seeing a movie a couple days ago, and it was just, if you disrespect your opponent by ignoring them or whatever, you're not going to. So you have to respect the opposition, whatever that opposition is, whether it's in our sphere or in politics in general or whatever. Certainly. If you're not paying attention to what they're working on, then you're not doing a good job yourself.
You diminish you both.
Yeah, exactly. So I think just that drive, and it comes in, it's going to be sports reporting, it's going to be environmental reporting, any political reporting. We're not, Western Wire isn't into sort of the gossip column kind of DC insider stuff. But you know what? We still pay attention to that because, that might be where we pick up who the next Interior Secretary is going to be.
Right.
And so those we're always paying attention to that. And if we can, bring value, add value by our own internal expertise, the folks that are working on Western Wire are folks, myself, not just journalism, but, an energy policy background. We bring that both at the state and the federal level. So you get a little bit of the Hill,
sure,
a little bit of definitely the Western perspective, Colorado, New Mexico, because these are, these states are very proud of who they are, what they do. So it's, sometimes calling into a place like New Mexico from Denver might as well be from DC. They're like, why are you calling from Denver? So expressing to them that we're, Western Energy Alliance is our group, and we have operators across the Rocky Mountain West. So we have a vested interest. It's not just, this weird group in Denver.
So you got a lot of balls in the air here.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a stressful juggle, but I think we're telling good stories and moving everything forward.
Well, as managing editor, how do you balance the need for coverage of things at the federal level? For instance, you spoke with former EPA Administrator Pruitt, as well as former Secretary Zinke, who just recently resigned, I think, this week. With things like covering La Plata County, Colorado, and county commissioners there. Does that balance sort of reveal itself to you, or how intentionally are you creating that balance?
I think it's some of it's just the gift of the calendar. So we're going to have a legislative session certainly starting here in Colorado in a few days. That'll go until May.
Right.
Other states also have their legislative session. Nevada does it every other year, so they're doing their legislative session this year. New Mexico, same thing.
Wyoming does. I had a friend who worked at the Capitol in Wyoming. Calls it 20 days and 40 nights.
Yep. So, yeah, and the usual thing as it is in Colorado is it's a slow start.
Oh yeah.
Building a crescendo at the end. So, the calendar works that way as well. So there's going to be a lot of stuff going on, but depending on when bills are scheduled that we're interested in, some of that is just sort of laid out for us by virtue of when people schedule things.
You've got some hurry up and wait.
Yeah, hurry up and wait. Federal level stuff, there's a new Congress, or at least a new House, and they're going to be interested in their pursuing their agenda, both legislatively and pursuing their agenda through hearings, I'm sure. So our schedule will be dictated by when they decide to do those things.
Sure.
So I think if you're looking at the overall schedule, the first 4 or 5 months of the year are going to be pretty busy. Thankfully, the state legislatures, at least in the West, don't do year-round.
Oh my!
They're fairly short compared to some other states.
Well, and it's funny to me that places like Nevada and Texas will do their legislative session every other year. And Texas, I know, goes as long as they need to. They don't have like a set calendar. They say we're going to do it every other year, but we're going to go for as long as we need to, and that could be a month, that could be 6 months. And to me, that seems like an insane way to run a railroad, but it works for them.
Well, and you also have, you have the Department of Energy DEQs, Department of Inequality, or CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They're doing things, certainly the regulatory agencies, BLM, DOI, EPA, they're doing stuff. So there's always a calendar of things going on. So when something subsides or, starts to wrap up, like the Colorado legislative session in early May, it's starting early this year, then we've got the summer, and there are going to be lots of things going on. Probably the federal level. So if you look at Western Wire coverage, it's probably more of a balancing act for the first 4 or 5 months because we're looking at legislatures and local stuff in addition to federal. And then summer is kind of more federal. But as we saw in 2018, it's an election year. Boom. Coming right back to, what was going on, especially in Colorado here with Proposition 112. So we brought it back definitely to the local level, and federal kind of just, was a little more ephemeral.
On the back burner.
Yeah, and La Plata County, something that started in 2017. Again, it was, open records, looking at stuff. I don't know if we can talk about it after the break, but like that kind of stuff is absolutely critical and important to the folks that are there. It's important to the larger conversation in the West about oil and gas policy. So, always try to work that in there, and there's always a lull for something like that to sort of fill in.
Yeah, to me it's interesting what you do, and it's been fun to watch it manifest because I remember when it launched a couple of years ago. We've spent a lot of time talking about what Western Wire is and talking about it philosophically. I think in our next segment we're going to talk quite a bit about some issues that are ongoing right now. We're going to wrap up 2018. We're going to look ahead to 19. We're going to talk about Colorado Rising and a number of other issues. Before we do that, where can people find Western Wire online?
westernwire.net.
All right, fantastic. You can find this podcast along with every other podcast we have on vitalforcolorado.com. That's VITALFOR Colorado, all spelled out, .com. Go to the Learn tab, videos and podcasts. You'll get this episode with Michael Sandoval, as well as every episode we've done. We've got more than 70 of them for you to listen to with thought leaders from all across Colorado and all across the country. Stay with us. We'll be back here for one more segment. Thank you for staying with us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. I am your on-air producer, also serving as guest host today, Jon Ekstrom. I'm joined today by Michael Sandoval. You are the managing editor of Western Wire. Thank you again for being here.
A pleasure.
So we spent the first segment talking a lot about the origin of Western Wire and filling in the gaps and where it is taking traditional media and moving it in a slightly different direction, or perhaps supplementing it. I don't necessarily want to pigeonhole it, because what you do is, to me, unique, because you're balancing local issues with federal issues and telling the story in a more nuanced way than I think our current media landscape lends itself to. So you've talked about some of the successes. Now let's talk about some of the issues. For instance, one thing that came up this week, this is brand new, Joe Salazar, former candidate for Attorney General, as well as former state legislator, is the new director of Colorado Rising. And I believe you all have talked about Joe Salazar before.
We have.
Can you give anyone who's listening who may not be familiar with the work of Joe Salazar a rundown of who he is and maybe who Colorado Rising is and why this intersection happened?
So, Joe Salazar is a former representative from Thornton, Colorado, and is, I think, stridently opposed to oil and gas development. Would not be inaccurate.
I would say you perhaps might be underplaying that.
He is someone who is very committed to his cause. Was an attorney general candidate in 2018, and is now leading a group called Colorado Rising. Colorado Rising was primary group behind Initiative 97 that became Proposition 112.
Right. That was defeated in November
yes.
By about 10 points.
Yes. So that is who he is. He's someone who's made some very bold statements. This week he called, he called defeating the fossil fuel dragon. Just checking my notes here. Want to make sure that we're quoting correctly. That's Western Wire. Tackle the big dragon, the fossil fuel dragon. Someone who is has spoken at we just covered this right before the holidays. Bill McKibben of 350.org was in town in late October to host a fundraiser for the Proposition 112 campaign, and that was a closed, I think, $100 per head fundraiser. We were not able to attend, but somebody decided to post the video on Facebook in an unlisted link, so it's not something anybody can search and find. And we found that, and did the story on it. And Joe was a speaker there. Joe served as an attorney / counsel for the campaign last year. When they were having some issues with their petition, the signatures. So someone he's very familiar with the issue. He's very familiar with the group, and so it was not at all surprising that this would be his post.
Right. What was the nature of that video that Bill McKibben and Joe Salazar, the $100 $100 person thing?
So they wanted to. Bill McKibben was basically saying wanted to fundamentally destroy oil and gas, and so
which ran contrary to the public
percent, which was
Proposition 112, which
was safety and health, which wasn't about killing industry. It's like, well, no, they can still drill and develop. It's just the setback. That was the media message of the campaign. But behind closed doors, it's always a little different. He has said that he would rather go to hell than allow this development to continue. That was in a video from I believe at least a year ago, and is someone who, as a state legislator, ran a bill last year that would have, in his words, operationalized the Martinez Court of Appeals decision, which took place in 2017, and that would have removed the fostering of oil and gas from the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's mission and replaced it with, until health, safety, and environmental issues have been taken care of, permits will not be issued for drilling.
And whatever that means.
Whatever that means. And so his bill was to take that, turn it into law at the time when it had been picked up by at the time, it was the state Supreme Court had decided to hear it. It didn't get heard until October, and we're still waiting for that decision. But he wanted to pursue legislation to, carve that in stone, and even some of his Democratic colleagues were like, we should probably wait until we see what the state Supreme Court says on this issue, because that was just a Court of Appeals decision, not a state the state Supreme Court. So someone who was very vocal at the state legislature, he's going to be doing the same thing in his new role at Colorado Rising. So it's going to be, we're wait and see what they have intended. I think they've mentioned things like lawsuits. Not sure what they were going to do in that case, but it seems like part of the mission is to turn Colorado Rising, which was focused around a setback ballot measure, turn it into essentially an ongoing political group.
Like a 24/7 campaign.
24/7 permanent campaign. They talked about forming a 501c3. So we're talking about, advocacy, fundraising, that sort of thing. And I think part of it is going to be whether they file as a lobbyist or not is going to be lobbying the legislators, certainly putting pressure on the Democrats because they now hold all the power at the state capitol. And I think the ongoing thing that we'd see later in the year and early next year would be primarying or just targeting, what they feel are the wishy-washy Democrats who are up for election in 2020. So that part of the campaign is to just put pressure on them once the legislative session's done, depending on how things go. So it looks like Colorado Rising is going to be a permanent campaign operation rather than just something that formed, got a ballot measure on the ballot, was not successful, and then just sort of disappears. So
they're going to continue pursuing the goals that they had for Proposition 112, which, if we sort of retrace our steps here, if it goes back to what Bill McKibben says, that means an end to oil and gas in Colorado. And until that is ultimately successful, this campaign, such as it is, will likely continue to exist.
Well, and I think part of what Western Wire always tried to show is that the campaign was never just about setbacks.
Right.
There is no magic number that, and this is, my personal opinion. There is no magic number that will tell activists that will all of a sudden be like, oh, we're done. Right. We've achieved health and safety in their minds, or however else they want to define it. So this is an ongoing campaign. They were never going to be satisfied by that. And when you actually read what they say, they don't want it at all. So it's not just, when it comes to BLM oil and gas leases, they don't want to protest it just because they have a problem with that parcel. They want to stop all oil and gas lease sales. So it isn't a question of sort of just trying to see that they're okay with whatever tightening of regulation is. They want to move beyond that. So it doesn't matter what is compromised, collaborated on, conceded. There's always the next step.
Right.
So
there's moving the goalposts.
Absolutely. And so we tell that's part of the thing of telling those stories and making sure that Colorado Rising doesn't escape, the scrutiny that it deserves. And so if there are stories, and certainly during the legislative session, there will be, I'm sure, quotes from Joe Salazar is the executive director of Colorado Rising, that we're always there to tell the media who these folks are. And so your earlier point about, we work in parallel. We're not adversarial to normal media. I mean, our goal is just be right there along with them. We're kind of doing our own, we're in our lane, but that information is shareable. So when the folks are, you get a story in the local media and it's just sort of this glowing quote, and it's like, well, here's the rest of the story. Again, that's my phrase. I'm sticking to it. That is what we're trying to do. Stepping back, a great example that's going to be coming up at the national level, the Green New Deal that some folks are on the Democratic side are putting forward. You'll see quotes by a group called the Sunrise Movement. Who's the Sunrise Movement? So we did a story, Western Wire did a story in September or October of 2017 on the Sunrise Movement. And we identified who are these people? Why is this, where's this coming from? And what we found out is that the divestment movement that largely failed at college campuses across the country, those folks have finally graduated. And now they're doing other stuff, and one of the things they're doing is the Sunrise Movement. So what the Sunrise Movement is, the leadership especially, but what the Sunrise Movement is the old divestment movement repackaged.
Wow.
and now they're pushing, the Green New Deal. That's their thing. And like I said, the folks that were in college 5-6 years ago in the divestment movement are now graduated, and so this is a job, and they're pushing, and now they have a Congress or a House to do some of this stuff.
Sure.
Take the issues to at least the House side of things. That's. We did that a year before they even appeared.
Right.
That way. And so we find out, it's like, this is the divestment. This isn't just, a brand new set of activists. This is just them repackaged as the Sunrise Movement. So
it's a brand refresh.
It's a brand refresh. Thankfully, there is no brand refresh. They've kept their name in Colorado Rising, so that's a little bit easier to trace. But, they have a track record, and it's going to be important, and it's going to be something we focus on to make sure that other folks know about what the track record is. That this isn't simply we're interested in everybody's, good whatever.
This is not a blue sky sort of proposition. There is an agenda at the end of this, and the goalposts continue to move. And to that point, I think this is interesting. A story last month that the Western Wire talked about was the school setback rule. And the headline is an epic collaboration between industry, schools, and conservation groups. And you see a number of stakeholders who engaged on this, and I'm going to read them. I have them in front of me. I'm going to read them. You had Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, Boulder County, Colorado Alliance of Mineral and Royalty Owners, Colorado Oil and Gas Association, Colorado Petroleum Council, Conservation Colorado, Garfield County, the League of Oil and Gas Impacted Coloradans, the Adams 12 5-star schools, and 27J School District, and the Colorado Association of School Boards. What you will not find in this list is Colorado Rising. And in the story that you wrote about this, and I can't remember if this was your story or one of your colleagues, but in this story, there are quotes from Colorado Rising saying, this is not a good rule. This rule doesn't go far enough. And one of the main talking points during the Proposition 112 campaign was, we need to get this further away from schools. This actually does get this further away from schools, yet it's not good enough. So it's that to me speaks as an example of moving the goalpost and not actually being interested in outcomes, but more political ends.
Well, one of the folks, I believe it was Heidi Hinkle, who was very vocal in the Proposition 112 campaign, was the one who said, basically, you guys are going to ignore the negative comments, the comments that disagreed with this collaboration at that hearing. And so basically, I'm ready to hit the sidewalks again and focus on a campaign. Probably in 2020 is some other setback measure. So no, it was clearly not satisfactory to them. But if you look at that group, there are not many times, at least in recent memory, on any issue, much less oil and gas, where you can get a group of stakeholders that includes, you have the oil and gas companies, you have the school districts, you have Conservation Colorado, Logic. If they're all on board, and they, the hearing itself, was the culmination of months of discussions and everything.
Yeah, give and take and negotiation.
Well, and I think collaboration has been something that the outgoing governor has talked about. It's sort of and other people in Colorado, for lack of a better word, have called it the Colorado way, of just sort of finding a compromise or finding some sort of middle ground rather than sort of extreme positions. So that's sort of a monumental achievement. And I think the epic quote was not my word. That was one of the members of COGCC who was like,
quotes.
Yeah, so, I got in quote. Well, they can't see it. It's an epic. No, but they were like, wow, this is great. And it was one of the other COGCC board members, made a joke about we should get a picture of all these attorneys that are representing these groups, because they are sort of, it's like they're all at the same table at the same time rather than pro and con, and so they actually joked about it, and they took a picture of the attorneys from these various groups, and so it was an achievement.
So and they weren't talking metaphorically.
No, literally took a photo because it was, they were like, wow, this is a real clear sign of agreement and, like I said, collaboration, and those were the words that they were using. And so when you're not on board with that, then the question is, what do you want?
Yeah.
Where are your goalposts?
Right.
So, it's never, it seems like it's never enough. And that's something that I haven't sat here as like, oh, well, I'm trying to figure out what's in the minds of no, this is what they say.
Right.
And our reporting bears that out. The quotes that they themselves give, the quotes that we've just been reading from this recent announcement from Colorado Rising, talking about forming a 501c3, pursuing legal action. These are, and calling them fossil fuel dragons. These are their words, and their words are beyond what they would probably have you believe in what in their press releases.
Right, and I think back to the methane rule of, I want to say this was 2013, when Colorado enacted tougher methane rules, and we're going to infrared cameras to detect fugitive methane emissions. One of the groups that worked on that was, I believe, EDF, Environmental Defense Fund. They got raked over the coals for working on this with industry, because you basically had Governor Hickenlooper say to the biggest producers in Colorado, along with EDF and along with his regulators, they were all locked in a room together and said, hey, don't come out until you've got a rule that you can work with. And I know, because the company that I worked for at the time was part of the group, and I talked to the guy who was involved in those negotiations. I said, how's it going? He said, it's brutal. It's awful. It's not fun. But at the end of the day, they came up with a rule that ultimately, across the country, people looked at Colorado and said, wow, they're actually addressing methane. Yet, for some environmental groups, they looked at that and said, why would you work with industry? Well, we're trying to actually move the ball forward. We're trying to have good outcomes. So the fact that, you've got Logic and Conservation Colorado in here, those are actual good outcomes that are measurable, and that you can stick your flag in the soil and say, look, we did something, we made things better, we heard concerns, and we addressed them, instead of just tying things up in lawsuits for goals that I personally believe to be a little bit nefarious.
Well, and it's an ongoing conversation. Right. There, like I said, for anyone who is interested in what was going on in Colorado, the question was, is this going to be enough? Is that going to be enough? Is an increase in setbacks? We had an increase in setbacks. Right. 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, that was 2012.
So 7 years ago now.
Something.
6 or 7 years ago.
I can't remember exactly when it was, but yes.
But we've had these conversations. We've had the methane rule. We've had stuff coming in at the federal level. These folks are not even in step with the Democrats in many cases. When we're talking about the last federal administration, the Obama administration, they didn't like the comments from EPA administrators that said, "Oh, fracking's not that bad." That kind of we need to. I mean, former President Obama just claimed credit for all of the increase in oil production. Yeah, very recently, that it was all him,
which
and positively. But it was interesting. But it's. They don't like that, and certainly they were not in favor of the outgoing administration in Colorado, with Governor Hickenlooper and his support for the oil and gas industry, and some of the comments he said. Senator Michael Bennett was given a lot of guff because he supported the Keystone XL pipeline. Right. I mean, you have
and Jordan Cove.
So there are a lot of disagreements within that party, and I think Joe Salazar, who's a Democrat, who ran as a Democrat, is certainly on one side of that issue within the party, and a group like Colorado Rising is going to, in their minds, hold the Democrats who are newly elected into majorities, hold their feet to the fire on these issues and try to force them to their side of the argument. Something that wasn't possible when it was a split legislature, but now there's no Senate Kill Committee held by Republicans that can stop some of this legislation. So the question now becomes: does Democratic leadership try to find a middle way, or does it go to one side of the issue like it did in 2013 with gun legislation?
Oh, right.
And does this get dropped on Governor Polis's desk for him to veto or sign or whatever.
Right.
So we're going to see, 2019 session that could be forced very, very pointedly in one direction, possibly. And it'll be interesting to see. There are some Democrats in the legislature that are still serving, who, they showed up at the against Proposition 112 rallies.
Right.
Or are they going to be pro-business? Are they going to sort of hold that line? Or are they going to be, does it matter because they have large majorities?
Right.
So they can afford to lose a few pro-business Democrats.
Well, and perhaps even for pro-business Democrats, it might be a fool's errand for them anyway. Everyone has to choose the hills that they want to die on, and this is certainly not the only issue facing the state legislature.
No, the usual things: healthcare, education, transportation. Those are all going to be
the usual
very top of mind. And for the folks, we work in the industry, so we're always thinking that the issues we're working on are the, but that definitely takes a fourth or fifth or sixth tier behind the healthcare and education and transportation kind of issues. So.
Well, one thing I want to talk about here in terms of environmental outcomes, because you mentioned at the federal level, and I was thinking back to Obama's big climate change speech in 2013, where he really rankled a lot of the environmental community by spending a lot of time talking about the importance of natural gas, and that was upsetting. We recently talked to Kathleen Skama, who is the head of the Western Energy Alliance, and one of the things that frustrates her most is the fact that the U.S. is leading the world in carbon emissions reductions, and that's largely in part to natural gas.
Yes.
Yet that's a story that never gets told. You've got a lot of focus, and I would say Governor Polis made a point in his campaign to talk about climate change, talked about going entirely to renewables. Yet when it comes to actual outcomes, switching from coal to natural gas has resulted in remarkable and dramatic carbon emissions. This is not me spouting some propaganda. This is purely science. And so that type of thing, I believe Western Wire has covered that in some depth as well. Is that true?
A little bit.
Okay. But to that end, how do you continue to tell that story? As we look ahead to 2019, what are the opportunities that you see? Where does Western Wire go, and what is its focus beyond sort of the immediate, breaking news? Here's what's happening in the legislature. Where do you hope to spend your energy?
Well, I think, to be in all honesty, it's going to be focused somewhat, probably entirely on some of the breaking news, just following where the policy conversation is.
I mean, naturally, but let's say,
sure.
Put that aside for a moment. And let's say you had a blank slate, and you wanted to tell a story that is undertold or underdeveloped. I understand the need to cover the breaking stuff.
Sure.
But if you had your druthers, where would you spend your energy?
Well, I think certainly telling that story is Kathleen is our boss.
Right.
Western Energy, we're a project of Western Energy Alliance. No, but I think telling the positives and getting not always into the rut of the responsive or just being in defensive posture. There are very good positive stories to tell. And that would be a great example. It's something that International Energy Administration and the Energy Information Administration in the United States has covered.
But
the other side always wants to pour water on it because there's methane emissions, and so we're offsetting anything. But the United States has clearly reduced its emissions. It's something even Bloomberg acknowledges. We're accomplishing the goals of Paris without being part of Paris.
Signing on to it.
So we are getting there. Lots of Democrats. And I know we're running out of time. Lots of Democrats supported natural gas as a bridge fuel. We know this from FOIAs. They were clearly on board with this 7 or 8 years ago as the bridge fuel to renewables. But it was the environmental groups who said, no, we can't have a bridge fuel. We need to go straight to. And now you see that as a narrative that we need to go right to renewables. The states are doing it. Governor Polis has advocated for it. So. Telling some of those more positive stories, we kind of keep that, in all honesty, on sort of the back burner from when we don't have anything else going on. But I'd love to share the success stories. We've got great success in New Mexico with the Permian Basin and all the revenue they're generating. So we've told that story. That's one of the things we want to keep doing in 2019.
And where can people find it?
westernwire.net.
Are you on social media?
Absolutely. Facebook and Twitter is Western Wire.
Fantastic. And you can find Vital for Colorado at vitalforcolorado.com. Go to the Learn tab, videos and podcasts. You'll find this episode with Michael Sandoval, managing editor of Western Wire, along with every other episode. Sign the pledge. We have a 7-point pledge, and we have over 87,000 members. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.